Hello, today is April 21st, 2026, and today we're going to begin our reading on Slaughterhouse 5 by Kurt Vonnegut Jr. We're going to be reading chapters 1 and 2 today. If you guys need to take a screenshot of any of the text, please feel welcome to. If you want to take notes about what I am talking about, please feel free to do so. This is all a resource for you. Chapter 1. All of this happened, more or less. The war parts, anyway, are pretty much true. One guy I knew really was shot in Dresden for taking a teapot that wasn't his. Another guy I knew really did threaten to have his personal enemies killed by hired gunmen after the war. And so on. I've changed all the names. I really did go back to Dresden with Guggenheim money, God love it, in 1967. It looked a lot like Dayton, Ohio. More open spaces than Dayton has. There must be tons of human bone meal in the ground. I went back there with an old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, and we became friends with the taxi driver, who took us to the slaughterhouse, where we had been locked up at night as prisoner of war. His name was Gerhard Muller. He told us that he was a prisoner of war, prisoner of the Americans for a while. We asked him how it was to live under communism, and he said it was terrible at first because everybody had to work so hard and because there wasn't much shelter or food or clothing. But things are much better now. He had a little pleasant apartment, and his daughter was getting an excellent education. His mother was incinerated in the Dresden firestorm. So it goes. He sent O'Hare a postcard at Christmas time. Here's what it said. I wish you and your family, also as to your friend, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. And I hope that we'll meet again in a world of peace and freedom in the taxicab, if the accident will. I like that very much, if the accident will. I would hate to tell you what this lousy little book cost me in money and anxiety and time. When I got home from the Second World War 23 years ago, I thought it would be easy for me to write about the destruction of Dresden, since all I would have to do would be to report what I had seen. And I thought, too, that it would be a masterpiece, or at least make me a lot of money, since the subject was so big. But many words about Dresden came from my mind then. But not many words came from my mind then. Not enough to make a book anyways. And not many words come now, either, when I have become an old fart with his memories and his small paws, with his sons fully grown. I think about how useless the Dresden part of my memory has been, and yet how tempting Dresden has been to write about. I am reminded of this famous limerick. There was a young man from Stamboul who who soliloquized thus to his tool. You took all my wealth, you ruined my health, and now you won't pee, you old fool. And I'm reminded, too, of the song that goes, my name is Jan Janssen, I work in Wisconsin, I work in a lumber mill there. The people I meet when I walk down the street, they say, what's your name? And I say, my name is Jan Janssen, I work in Wisconsin. And so on to infinity. Over the years, people I've met often ask me what I'm working on, and I've usually replied that the main thing was a book about Dresden. I said that to Harrison Starr, the movie maker, one time, and he raised his eyebrow and inquired, "Is it an anti-war book?" "Yes," I said. "I guess." You know what I say to people when I hear they're writing anti-war books? "No, what do you say, Harrison Starr?" I say, why don't you write an anti-glacier book instead? What he meant, of course, was that there would always be wars, that they were as easy to stop as glaciers. I believe that too. And even if wars didn't keep coming like glaciers, there would still be plain old death. When I was somewhat younger, working on my famous Dresden book, I asked an old war buddy named Bernard V. O'Hare if I could come see him. He was a district attorney in Pennsylvania. I was a writer on Cape Cod. We had been privates in the war, infantry scouts. We had never expected to make money after the war, but we were doing quite well. I had the Bell Telephone Company find him for me. They are wonderful that way. I have this disease late at night sometimes, involving alcohol and the telephone. I get drunk, and I drive my wife away with a breath like mustard gas and roses. Then, speaking gravely and elegantly into the telephone, I ask the telephone operators to connect me with this friend or that one, from whom I have not heard from in years. I got O'Hare on the line in this way. He was short, and I am tall. We were Mutt and Jeff in the war. We were captured together in the war. I told him who I was on the telephone. He had no trouble believing it. He was up. He was reading. Everybody in his house was asleep. Listen, I said. I'm writing a book about Dresden. I'd like some help remembering stuff. I wonder if I could come down and see you, and we could drink and talk and remember. He was unenthusiastic. He said he couldn't remember much. He told me, though, to come ahead. I think the climax of the book will be the execution of poor old Edgar Derby, I said. The irony is so great. A city gets burned down and thousands of people are killed. Then this one American foot soldier is arrested in the ruins from taking a teapot, and he gets a regular trial. Then he's shot by a firing squad. Says O'Hare, you don't think that's really where the climax should come? I don't know anything about it, he said. That's your trade, not mine. As a trafficker in climaxes and thrills, in characterization, in wonderful dialogue, in suspense and confrontations, I had outlined the Dresden story many times. The best outline I ever made, or anyway, the prettiest one, was on the back of a roll of wallpaper. I used my daughter's crayons, a different color for each main character. On the end of the wallpaper was the beginning of the story, and the other end was the end. Then there was all that middle part, which was the middle. And the blue line met the red line, and then the yellow line, and then the yellow line stopped because the characters represented by the yellow line was dead, and so on. The destruction of Dresden was represented by a vertical band of orange cross-hatching, and all the lines that were still alive passed through it, came out the other side. The end, where the line stopped, was a beet field on the Elbe, outside of Halle. The rain was coming down. The war in Europe had been over for a couple of weeks. We were formed in ranks with the Russian soldiers guarding us, Englishmen, Americans, Dutchmen, Belgians, Frenchmen, Canadians, South Africans, New Zealanders, Australians, thousands of us about to stop being prisoners of war. And on the other side of the field were thousands of Russians and Poles and Yugoslavians and so on, guarded by American soldiers. An exchange was made there in the rain, 1 for 1. O'Hare and I climbed into the back of an American truck with a lot of others. O'Hare didn't have any souvenirs. Almost everybody else did. I had a ceremonial Luftwaffe saber. Still do. The rabid little American I call Paul Lazaro in this book had about a quart of diamonds and emeralds and rubies and so on. He had taken these from dead people in the cellars of Dresden. So it goes. An idiotic Englishman who had lost all of his teeth somewhere had a souvenir in a canvas bag. The bag was resting on my insteps. He would peek into the bag every now and then, and he would roll his eyes, swivel his scrawny neck, trying to catch people looking covetously at his bag. And he would bounce the bag on my insteps. I thought this bouncing was accidental, but I was mistaken. He had to show somebody what was in the bag, and he decided he could trust me. He caught my eye, winked, opened the bag. There is a plaster model of the Eiffel Tower in there. It was painted gold. It had a clock in it. A smashing thing, he said. And we were flown to a rest camp in France, where we were fed chocolate molten milkshakes and other rich foods until we were all covered with baby fat. Then we were sent home. I married a pretty girl who was covered with baby fat too. And we had babies. And now they're all grown up. And I'm an old fart with his memories and his mole paws. My name is Jan Janssen. I work in Wisconsin. I work there in a lumber mill. Sometimes I try to call up old friends on the telephone late at night after my wife has gone to bed. Operator, I wonder if you could give me the number of Mrs. So-and-so. I think she lives at such and such. I'm sorry, sir. There's no such listing. Thanks, operator. Thanks just the same. I let the dog out or I let him in and we talk some. I let him know I like him and he lets me know he likes me. He doesn't mind the smell of mustard gas and roses. You're all right, Sandy, I say to the dog. You know that, Sandy? You're okay. Sometimes I'll turn on the radio and listen to a talk program from Boston or New York. I can't stand recorded music if I've been drinking a good deal. Or sooner or later, my wife asks me what time it is. She has to know the time. Sometimes I don't know, and I say, search me. I think about my education sometimes. I went to the University of Chicago for a while after the Second World War. I was a student in the Department of Anthropology, and at that time, they were teaching that there was absolutely no difference between anybody. They may be teaching that still. Another thing they taught me was that nobody was ridiculous or bad or disgusting. Shortly before my father died, he said to me, you know, you never wrote a story with a villain in it. I told him that one of the things I learned I told him that was one of the things I learned in college after the war. While I was studying to be an anthropologist, I was working as a police reporter for the famous Chicago City News Bureau for $28 a week. One time, they switched me from the night shift to the day shift, so I worked 16 hours straight. We were supported by all the newspapers in towns, and the AP and the UP and all that. And we would cover the courts and the police stations and the fire department and the Coast Guard out on Lake Michigan and all of that. We were connected to institutions that supported us by means of pneumatic tubes which ran under the streets of Chicago. Reporters would telephone in stories to writers wearing headphones, and the writers would stencil the stories on mimeograph paper sheets. The stories were mimeographed and stuffed into a brass and velvet cartridges, which the pneumatic tubes ate. The very rough reporters and writers were women who had taken over the jobs of men who'd gone to war. In the first story I covered, I had to dictate over the telephone, to one of those beastly girls. It was about a young veteran who had taken a job running an old-fashioned elevator in an office building. The elevator door was on the first floor, was ornamental iron lace. Iron ivy snaked in and out of the holes. There was an iron twig with 2 iron lovebirds perched on it. This veteran decided to take his car into the basement, and he closed the door and started down. But his wedding ring was caught in all of the ornaments. So he was hoisted into the air, and the floor of the car went down, dropping him from under, and the top of the car squashed him. So it goes. So I phoned this in, and the woman who was going to cut the stencil asked me, what did his wife say? She doesn't know yet, I said. It just happened. Call her up and get a statement. What? Tell her you're Captain Finn of the fire department. Say you have some sad news. Give her the news and see what she says. So I did. She said about what you expect her to say. There's a baby, and so on. When I got back to the office, the woman writer asked me, just for her own information, what the squashed guy had looked like when he was squashed. I told her. Did it bother you? She said. She was eating a Three Musketeers candy bar. Heck no, I said. I've seen a lot worse than that in the war. Even then, I was supposedly writing a book about Dresden. It wasn't a famous air raid back in America. Not many Americans knew how much worse it had been than Hiroshima, for instance. I didn't know that either. There hadn't been much publicity. I happened to tell a University of Chicago professor at a cocktail party about the raid as I had seen it, about the book I would write. He was a member of a thing called the Committee of Social Thought. He told me about the concentration camps and about how the Germans made soap and candles out of the fat of dead Jews and so on. All I could say was, I know, I know, I know. The Second World War had certainly made everybody very tough, and I became a public relations man for General Electric and Schenectady, New York, and a local fireman in the village of Alpas, where I bought my first home. My boss was My boss there was one of the toughest guys I ever hoped to meet. He had been a lieutenant colonel in public relations in Baltimore. When I was in that town, he joined the Dutch Reformed Church, which is a very tough church indeed. He used to ask me sneeringly sometimes why I hadn't been an officer, as though I did something wrong. My wife and I lost our baby fat. Those were our scrawny years. We had lost a lot of scrawny veterans and their scrawny wives for friends. The nicest veterans in the city in New York, I thought, the kindest and the funniest ones. The ones who hated the war most were the ones who'd really fought. I wrote the Air Force back then asking for details about the raid of Dresden, who ordered it, how many planes did it, why they did it, what desirable results there had been, and so on. I was answered by a man who, like myself, was in public relations. He said that he was sorry, but that information was top secret still. I read the letter out loud to my wife, and I said, "Secret? My God, from whom?" We were United World Federalists back then. I don't know what we are now. Telephoners, I guess? We telephone a lot. Or I do, anyway, late at night. A couple of weeks after I telephoned my old war buddy, Bernard V. O'Hare, I really did go see him. That must have been in 1964 or so. Whatever the last year was for the New York World's Fair. My name is Jan Janssen. There was a young man from Chambol. I took 2 little girls with me, my daughter, Nanny, and her best friend, Allison Mitchell. They had never been off Cape Cod before. When we saw a river, we had to stop so they could stand by it and think about it for a while. They had never seen water in that long and narrow, unsalted form before. The river was the Hudson. There was a carp in there, and we saw them. They were as big as atomic submarines. We saw waterfalls, too, streams jumping off cliffs into the valley of the Delaware. There were lots of things to stop and see, and then it was time to go, always time to go. The little girls were wearing white party dresses and black shoes, so strangers would know at once how nice they were. "Time to go, girls," I'd say, and we would go. And the sun went down, and we had supper in an Italian place. Then I knocked on the front door of the beautiful stone house of Bernard V. O'Hare. I was carrying a bottle of Irish whiskey like a dinner bell. I met my nice wife, Mary, to whom I dedicated this book. I dedicated it to Gerhard Muller, the Dresden taxi driver, too. Mary O'Hare is a trained nurse, which is a lovely thing for a woman to be. Mary admired the 2 little girls I'd brought, mixed them in with her own children. Sent them all upstairs to play games and watch television. It was only after the children were gone that I sensed Mary didn't like me, or didn't like something about that night. She was polite, but chilly. "It's a cozy it's a cozy house you have here," I say, and it really was. I've fixed up a place where you can talk and not be bothered," she said. "Good," I said. I imagined 2 leather chairs near a fireplace in a paneled room, where 2 old soldiers could drink and talk. But she took us to the kitchen. She had put 2 straight-back chairs at a kitchen table with a white porcelain top. The tabletop was screaming with reflected light from a 200-watt bulb overhead. Mary had prepared an operating room. She only had 1 glass on it, which was for me. She explained that O'Hare couldn't drink the hard stuff since the war. We sat down, O'Hare embarrassed, but he wouldn't tell me what was wrong. I couldn't imagine what it was about me that would bum up Mary so. I was a family man. I'd been married once. I wasn't drunk. I hadn't done her husband any dirt in the war. She fixed herself a Coca-Cola, made a lot of noise banging the ice cube in the stainless steel sink when she went into the other part of the house, but she wouldn't sit still. She was moving all over the house, opening and shutting doors, even moving furniture around to work off anger. I asked O'Hare if I had said or done anything to make her act that way. "It's all right," he said. "Don't worry about it. It doesn't have anything to do with you." That was kind of him. He was lying. It had everything to do with me. So we tried to ignore Mary and remember the war. I took a couple of belts of the booze I'd bought. We would chuckle or grin sometimes, as though war stories were coming back. but neither of us could remember anything good. O'Hare remembered one guy who got into a lot of wine at Dresden before it was bombed, and we had to take him home in a wheelbarrow. It wasn't much to write a book about. I remembered two Russians who had looted a clock factory. They were horse-drawn wagon full. They had a horse-drawn wagon full of clocks. They were happy and drunk. They were smoking huge cigarettes and that they rolled in newspaper. That was about it for memories, and Mary was still making noises. She finally came out of the kitchen again for another Coke. She took another tray of ice cubes from the refrigerator, banged it in the sink, even though there was already plenty of ice out. Then she turned to me, let me see how angry she was, and that the anger was for me. She had been talking to herself, so what she'd said was a fragment of a much larger conversation. You were just babies then, she said. What? You were just babies in the war, like the ones upstairs. I nodded that this was true. We had been foolish virgins in the war, right at the end of childhood. But you're not going to write it that way, are you? This wasn't a question. This was an accusation. I don't know, I said. Well, I know, she said. You'll pretend you were men instead of babies, and you'll be played in movies with Frank Sinatra or John Wayne or some other of those glamorous, war-loving, dirty old men. And war will just look wonderful, and we'll have a lot more of them, and they'll be fought by babies like the babies upstairs. So then I understood. It was war that made her angry. She didn't want her babies or anyone else's babies killed in wars, and she thought wars were partly encouraged by books and movies. So I held up my right hand and I made her a promise. Mary, I said, I don't think this book is ever going to be finished. I must have written 5,000 pages by now and thrown them all away. If I ever do finish it, though, I give you my word of honor. There won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. I'll tell you what, I said. I'll call it the Children's Crusade. She was my friend after that. O'Hare and I gave up on remembering, went to the living room, talked about other things. We became curious about the real Children's Crusade, so O'Hare looked it up on a book he had, Extraordinary Popular Delusions and Madness of Crowds by Charles Mackay, LL.D. It was first published in London in 1841. Mackay had a low opinion of all the Crusades. The Children's Crusades struck him only as slightly more sordid than the 10 Crusades for grown-ups. O'Hare read this handsome passage out loud. History, in her solemn page, informs us that the Crusades were but ignorant and savage men, that their motives were those of bigotry unmitigated, and that their pathway was one of war, of blood and wars. Romance, on the other hand, dilates upon their piety and heroism, and portrays, in her most glowing and impassioned hues, their virtue and magnanimity, the imperishable honor they acquire for themselves, and the great services they rendered to Christianity. And then O'Hare read this. Now, what was the grand result of all these struggles? Europe expended millions of her treasures and the blood of 2 million of her people, and a handful of quarrelsome knights retained possession of Palestine for about 100 years. Mackay told us that the Children's Crusade started in 1213, when 2 monks got the idea of raising armies of children in Germany and France and selling them in North Africa as slaves. 30,000 children volunteered, thinking they were going to Palestine. They were no doubt idle and deserted children who generally swarm in great cities, nurtured on vice and daring, and ready for anything. Pope Innocent III thought they were going to Palestine too, and he was thrilled. These children are awake while we're asleep, he said. Now, this is one thing that I do want to highlight, which this is page 11, I guess, is this whole paragraph right here. So, chapter 1, this is all in the POV of the author. And this is all going to be about author's purpose, right? But this right here is establishing that this is anti-war and making sure that we are not portraying this as glamorous. So not glamorous. I just wanted to highlight that because this will be important for your reflection and your CER about why this book is banned. Most children were shipped out of Marseilles, and about half of them drowned in shipwrecks. The other half got to North Africa, where they were sold. Through a misunderstanding, some of the children reported for duty at Genoa, and where no slave ships were waiting. They were fed and sheltered and questioned kindly by good people there, then given a little money and a lot of advice and sent back home. Hooray for the good people of Genoa, said Mary O'Hare. I slept that night in one of the children's rooms. O'Hare had put a book for me on the bedside table. It was Dresden, History, Stage, and Gallery by Mary Endell. It was published in 1908. And its introduction began. It is hoped that this little book will make itself useful. Its attempt to give an English reading public a bird's eye view of how Dresden came to look as it does, architecturally, of how it expanded musically, through the genius of a few men, to its present bloom, and to call attention to certain permanent landmarks in art that make its gallery a resort of these seeking lasting impressions. I read some history further on. Now, in 1760, Dresden underwent siege by the Prussians. On the 15th of July began the cannonade. The picture valley took fire. Many of the paintings had been transported to the Königstein, and some were seriously injured by the splinters of bombshells, notably Francia's baptism of church. Furthermore, the stately Kreuzkirche tower, from which the enemy's movement had been watched every day and night, stood in flames. It later succumbed in sturdy contrast with the pitiful fate of Kreuzkirche. Stood the Frauenkirches, from the curves of whose stone dome the Prussian bombs rebounded like rain. Friedrich was obligated finally to give up the siege because he learned of the fall of Glatz, the critical point in his new conquest. We must be off to Silesia so that we do not lose everything. The devastation of Dresden was boundless. When the Goethe, as a young student, visited the city, he still found sad ruins. Von der Kuppel der Frauenkirche suck ich these Leidingen Trümmer. I'm not going to try reading all of this. And it doesn't have a translation. The two little girls and I crossed the Delaware where George Washington had crossed it the next morning. We went to the New York World's Fair, saw what past had been like, according to the Ford Motor Car Company and Walt Disney, and saw what the future could be like, according to General Motors. And I asked myself about the present, how wide it was, how deep it was, how much was mine to keep. I taught creative writing in the famous writer's workshop at the University of Iowa for a couple years after that. I got into some perfectly beautiful trouble, got out of it again. I taught in the afternoons, in the mornings I wrote. I was not to be disturbed. I was working on my famous book about Dresden. And somewhere in there, a nice man named Seymour Lawrence gave me a 3-book contract, and I said, okay, the first of the 3 will be my famous book about Dresden. The friends of Seymour Lawrence called him Sam, and I say to Sam now, Sam, here's the book. It is so short and jumbled and jangled. Sam, because there is nothing intelligent to say about a massacre. Everybody is supposed to be dead, to never say anything or want anything again. Everything is supposed to be very quiet after a massacre, and always is, except for the birds. And what do the birds say? All there is to say about a massacre, things like pooty wheat. I have told my sons that they are not under any circumstances to take part in massacres, and that the news of massacres of enemies is to not fill them with satisfaction or glee. I'm going to pause again because this is going to be foreshadowing. Again, this is all about author's purpose, right? But it's because of this line right here. Because I believe that we're going to see that at the end of the book. And I've read this book, and I'm pretty sure that's how it is. I have also told them not to work for companies which make massacre machinery, and to express contempt for people who think we need machinery like that. As I have recently went back to Dresden with my friend O'Hare, we had a million laughs in Hamburg and West Berlin and East Berlin and Vienna and Salzburg and Helsinki and Leningrad too. It was very good for me because I saw a lot of authentic backgrounds for made-up stories, which I will write later on. One of them will be Russian baroque, and another will be No Kissing, and another one will be Dollar Bar, and another one will be If the Accident Will, and so on, and so on. There was a Lufthansa plane that was supposed to fly from Philadelphia to Boston to Frankfurt. O'Hare was supposed to get on in Philadelphia, and I was supposed to get in on Boston, and we'd go off. But Boston was sucked in, so the plane flew straight from Frankfurt to Philadelphia, and I became a non-person in the Boston fog, and Lufthansa put me in a limousine with some other non-persons and sent us to a motel for the non-night. The time would not pass. Somebody was playing with the clocks, and not only with the electric clocks, but the wind-up kind too. The second hand on my watch would twitch once, and a year would pass. Then it would start twitching, then it would twitch again. There was nothing I could do about it. As an earthling, I had to believe whatever clocks said and calendars. I had 2 books with me, which I had meant to read on the plane. One was Words for the Wind by Theodore Rothko, and this is what I found in there. I wake to steep and take my waking slow. I feel my laid in what I cannot fear. I learn by going where I have to go. My other book was by Erika Ostrovsky's Celine and His Vision. Celine was a brave French soldier in the First World War until his skull was cracked. After that, he couldn't sleep, and there were noises in his head. He became a doctor, and he treated poor people in daytime, and he wrote grotesque novels all night. No art is possible without a dance with death, he wrote. The truth is death, he wrote. I've fought nicely against it as long as I could, danced with it, festooned it, waltzed around it, decorated it with streamers, titillated it. Time obsessed him. Miss Ostrowski reminded me the amazing scene in Death on an Installment Plan where Celine wants to stop the bustling of street crowd. He screams on the paper, "Make them stop. Don't let them move anymore at all. There, make them freeze, once and for all. And so that they won't disappear anymore." I looked through the Gideon Bible in my motel room for tales of destruction. The sun was risen upon the earth when Lot entered into Zoar, I read. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities, and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which grew upon the ground. So it goes. Those were the vile people in both of the cities, and it is well known. The world was better off without them. And Lot's wife, of course, was told not to look back when all those people in their homes had been. But she did look back, and I love her for that, because it was so human. She turned into a pillar of salt, so it goes. People aren't supposed to look back. I'm certainly not going to do it anymore. I've finished my war book now. The next one I write is going to be fun. This one is a failure, and had to be, since it was written by a pillar of salt, It begins like this. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. And it ends with Pooty Wheat. All right, so let's dissect the first chapter of this book, shall we? We've already done a little bit. So, first things first, author's purpose. His purpose, it's an intro to the book. This is also the author's POV. It is Von Gott's memories about Dresden and World War II. So this book all centers around one key thing, and he's made that abundantly clear. World War II and Dresden. This is only information that we need to know about what he's writing about so that we'll understand. All right, let's move to part 2, or chapter 2, but I'm going to pause real quick. All right, chapter 2. Listen, Billy Pilgrim has come unstuck in time. He has gone to sleep, a senile widower, and awakened on his wedding day. He has walked through a door in 1955 and come out another in 1941. He had gone back through that door to find himself in 1963. He has seen his birth and death many times, he says, and pays random visits to all events in between. He says, Billy is spastic in time, has no control where he is going next, and the trips aren't necessarily fun. He's in a constant state of stage fright, he says, because he never knows what part of his life he is going to have to act in the next. Billy was born in 1922, Ilium, New York, the only child of a barber there. He was a funny-looking child. He became a funny-looking, young, tall, and weak, and shaped like a bottle of Coca-Cola. He graduated from Ilium High School in the upper third of his class and attended night sessions at the Ilium School of Optometry for 1 semester before being drafted for the military service of the Second World War. His father died in a hunting accident during the war. So it goes. Billy saw service with the infantry in Europe and was taken prisoner by the Germans. After his honorable discharge from the army in 1945, Billy again enrolled in the Ilium School of Optometry. During his senior year there, he became engaged to the daughter of the founder and owner of the school and suffered a mild nervous collapse. He was treated in a veterans hospital near Lake Placid and was given shock treatments and released. He married his fiancée, finished his education, and was set up in business in Ilium by his father-in-law. Ilium is a particularly good city for optometrists because General Forge and the foundry company is still there. Every employee is required to own a pair of safety glasses and to wear them in areas where manufacturing is going on. GFNF has 68,000 employees in Ilium. That calls for a lot of lenses and a lot of frames. Frames are where the money is. We're going to pause because we're going to highlight. Since we know that this is going to be jumping around in time a lot, at the end of this, we're going to have I'm going to make a timeline for you guys. This is when he was born. So he was born in 1922. We're going to mark the time. It's this. And also, I just want to underline this guy right here because there is a lot of repetition of this phrase. All right. Bill became rich. He had 2 children, Barbara and Robert. In time, his daughter Barbara married another optometrist, and Billy set him up in the business. Billy's son Robert had a lot of trouble in high school, but when he joined the famous Green Berets, he straightened out, became a fine young man, and he fought in Vietnam. Early in 1968, a group of optometrists, with Billy among them, chartered in a plane to fly them from Ilium to an international convention of optometrists in Montreal. The plane crashed on top of Sugarbush Mountain in Vermont. Everybody was killed but Billy, so it goes. While Billy was recuperating in the hospital, his wife died accidentally of carbon monoxide poisoning, so it goes. When Billy finally got home to Ilium after the airplane crash, he was quiet for a while. He had a terrible scar across his skull. He didn't resume practice. He had a housekeeper. His daughter came over almost every day. And then, without warning, Billy went to New York City and got into an all-night radio program devoted to talk. He told about having come unstuck in time. He said, too, that he had been kidnapped by a flying saucer in 1967. The saucer was from the planet Talmafador, he said. He was taken to Talmafador, where he was displayed naked in a zoo, he said. He made it there with a former Earthling movie star named Montana Wildhack. So we're also going to put in this one, that he was in a plane crash, and that apparently he had been kidnapped and taken to this planet. Some night owls in Ilium heard Billy on the radio, and one of them called Billy's daughter Barbara. Barbara was upset. She and her husband went down to New York and brought Billy home. Billy insisted mildly that everything he had said on the radio was true. He said he had been kidnapped by the Tralfamadorians on the night of his daughter's wedding. He hadn't been missed, he said, because the Tralfamadorians had taken him through a time warp so that he could be on Tralfamador for years and still be away from Earth for only a microsecond. Another month went on without accident, and when Billy wrote a letter to Ilium news leader, which the paper was published, it described the creatures from Tralfamador. The letter said that they were 2 feet high and green and shaped like plumbers' friends. Their suction cups were on the ground, and their shafts, which were extremely flexible, usually pointed to the sky. At the top of each shaft was a little hand with a green eye in its palm. The creatures were friendly, and they could see in 4 dimensions. They pitied Earthlings for only being able to see only 3. They had wonderful things to teach Earthlings, especially about time. Billy promised to tell what some of those wonderful things were in his next letter. Billy was working on his second letter when the first letter was published. The second letter started out like this. The most important thing I learned on Tralfamador was that when a person dies, he only appears to die. He is very much alive in the past, and it is very silly for people to cry at his funeral. All moments of past, present, and future have already existed, always will exist. The Tralfamadorians can look at the different moments just the way we can look at the stretch of the Rocky Mountains, for instance. They can see how permanent all the moments are, and they can look at any moment and interest them. It is just an illusion we have here on Earth, and that one moment follows another, like beads on a string, and with once a moment is gone, it is gone forever. When a Tralfamadorian sees a corpse, all he sees is that the dead person is in a bad condition in that particular moment, but that same person is just fine in plenty of other moments. Now, when I myself hear that somebody's dead, I simply shrug and say what the Tralfamadorians say about dead people, which is, so it goes, and so on. Oops. We're going to underline these for repetition. Billy was working on this letter in the basement rumpus room of his empty house. It was his housekeeper's day off. There was an old typewriter in the rumpus room. It was a beast. It weighed as much as a storage battery. Billy couldn't carry it very far very easily, which is why he was writing in the rumpus room instead of somewhere else. The oil burner had quit. A mouse had eaten through the insulation of a wire leading to the thermostat. The temperature in the house was down to 50 degrees, but Billy hadn't noticed. He wasn't warmly dressed either. He was barefoot and still in his pajamas and a bathrobe, though it was late afternoon. His bare feet were blue and ivory. The cockles of Billy's heart, at any rate, were glowing coals. What made them so hot was Billy's belief that he was going to comfort so many people with the truth about time. His door chimes upstairs had been ringing and ringing. It was his daughter Barbara up there wanting in. She let herself in with a key across the floor over his head, calling, "Father? Daddy? Where are you?" and so on. Billy didn't answer. She was nearly hysterical, expecting to find his corpse, and then she looked into the very last place there was to look, which was the rumpus room. "Why didn't you answer me when I called?" Barbara wanted to know, standing there in the door of the rumpus room. She had the afternoon paper with her, the one in which Billy described his friends from Tralfamadore. "I didn't hear you," said Billy. The orchestration of this moment was this. Barbara was only 21 years old, but she thought her father was senile, even though he was only 46, senile because of damage to his brain in the airplane crash. She also thought that she was head of the family since she had to manage her mother's funeral, since she had to get a housekeeper for Billy, and all that. Also, Barbara and her husband were having to look after Billy's business interests, which were considerable since Billy didn't seem to give a damn for business anymore. All this responsibility at such an early age made her a bitchy tibbidget. And Billy, meanwhile, was trying to hang on to his dignity, to persuade Barbara and everyone else that he was far from senile, that, on the contrary, he was devoting himself to a calling much higher than mere business. He was doing nothing less now, and he thought then prescribing corrective lenses for earthling souls. So many of those souls were lost and wretched, Billy believed, because they could not see as well as his little green friends on Tralfamadore. "Don't lie to me, Father," said Barbara. "I know perfectly well you heard me when I called. This was a fairly pretty girl, except that she had legs like an Edwardian grand piano. Now she raised hell with him about the letter in the paper. She said he was making a laughingstock of herself and everybody associated with him. Father, 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 what are we going to do with you? Are you going to force us to put you where Mother is? Billy's mother is still alive. She was in a bed in an old people's home called Pine Knoll on the edge of Ilium. What is it about my letter that makes you so mad? Billy wants to know. It's all just crazy. None of it is true. It's all true. Bill's anger was not going to rise with hers. He never got mad at anything. He was wonderful that way. There is no such planet as Tralfamadore. It can't be detected from Earth if that's what you mean, said Billy. Earth can't be detected from Tralfamadore. As far as that goes, they're both very small. They're both very far apart. Where did you get a crazy name like Tralfamadore? That's what the creatures who live there call it. Oh, God, said Barbara, and she turned her back on him. She celebrated frustration by clapping her hands. May I ask a simple question? Of course. Why is it you never mentioned any of this before the airplane crash? I didn't think the time was ripe. And so on. Billy says that he first came unstuck in time in 1944, long before his trip to Tralfamadore. The Tralfamadorians didn't have anything to do with his coming unstuck. They were simply able to give him insights into what was really going on. Billy first became unstuck and the Second World War was in progress. Billy was a chaplain's assistant in the war. A chaplain's assistant is a customary figure of fun in the American Army. Billy was no exception. He was powerless to harm the enemy or to help his friends. In fact, he had no friends. He was a valet to a preacher, expected no promotions or medals, bore no arms, and had a meek faith in a loving Jesus, which most soldiers found putrid. While on maneuvers in South Carolina, Billy played hymns he knew from childhood, played them on a little black organ which was waterproof. It had 39 keys and 2 stops, Vox Humana and Vox Celeste. He also had charge of a portable altar, an olive drab attaché case with telescoping legs. It was lined with crimson plush, and nestled in that passionate plush was an anodized aluminum cross and a Bible. The altar and the organ were made by a human vacuum. Oh, Lord. The altar and the organ were made by a vacuum cleaner company in Camden, New Jersey, and said so. One time on the maneuvers, Billy was playing A Mighty Fortress Is Our God with music by Johann Sebastian Bach and the words by Martin Luther. It was Sunday morning. Billy and his chaplain had gathered a congregation of about 50 soldiers on a Caroline hillside. An umpire appeared. There were umpires everywhere, men who said who was winning and who was losing the theoretical battle, who was alive and who was dead. The umpire had comical news. The congregation had been theoretically spotted from the air by a theoretical enemy. They were all theoretically dead now. The theoretical corpse laughed and ate a hearty noontime meal. Remembering this incident years later, Billy was struck by what a Tralfamadorian adventure with death had been, to be dead and to eat at the same time. Toward the end of the maneuvers, Billy was given an emergency furlough home because his father, the barber in Ilium, New York, was shot dead by a friend while they were out hunting. So it goes. Okay, so we just had 2 big time jumps here. So all of this will count as present, which is, I think, 1967 to 1968, and this is all 1944. This is all World War II/war stories. When Billy got back from his furlough, there were orders for him to go overseas. He was needed in the headquarters company of an infantry regime fighting in Luxembourg. The regimeable chaplain's assistant had been killed in action. So it goes. When Billy joined the regiment, it was in the process of being destroyed by the Germans in the famous Battle of Bulge. Billy had never got to meet the chaplain he was supposed to assist, was never even issued a steel helmet and combat boots. This was December of 1944, during the last mighty German attack of the war. Billy survived, but he was a dazed wanderer far behind the new German lines. 3 other wanderers, not quite so dazed, allowed Billy to tag along. 2 of them were scouts, and 1 was an anti-tank gunner. They were without food or maps. Avoiding Germans, they were delivering themselves in rural silence ever more profound. They ate snow. They went Indian file. First came the scouts, clever, graceful, quiet. They had rifles. Next came the anti-tank gunner, clumsy and dense, warning Germans away with a Colt 45 automatic in one hand and a trench knife in the other. Last came Billy Pilgrim, empty-handed, bleakly ready for death. Billy was preposterous 6 feet and 3 inches tall, with a chest and shoulders like a box of kitchen matches. He had no helmet, no overcoat, no weapon, and no boots. On his feet were cheap, low-cut civilian shoes, which he had bought for his father's funeral. Billy had lost a heel, which made him bob up and down, up and down. The involuntary dancing up and down, made his hip joints sore. Billy was wearing a thin field jacket, a shirt and trousers of scratchy wool, and long underwear that was soaked with sweat. He was only one of 4 who had a beard. And it was a random bristly beard, and some of the bristles were white. Even though Billy was only 21 years old, he was going to go bald. Wind and cold and violent exercise had turned his face crimson. He didn't look like a soldier at all. He looked like a filthy flamingo. And on the 3rd day of wandering, somebody shot at the 4 from far away 4 times as they crossed a narrow brick road. One shot was for the scouts. The next one was for the anti-tank gunner, whose name was Ronald Wary. The 3rd bullet was for the filthy flamingo, who stopped dead center in the road when the lethal bee buzzed past his ear. Billy stood there politely, giving the marksman another chance. It was his addled understanding of rules of warfare that the marksman should be given another chance. The next shot missed Billy's kneecaps by inches, going end on end from the sound of it. Ronald Wary and the scouts were safe in a ditch, and Wary growled at Billy, "Get out the road, you dumb motherfucker." The last word was still a novelty in speech of white people in 1944. It was fresh and astonishing to Billy, who had never fucked anybody, and it did its job. It woke him up, and he got off the road. "Saved your life again, you dumb bastard," Wary said to Billy in the ditch. He had been saving Billy's life for days, cursing him, kicking him, slapping him, making him move. It was absolutely necessary in that cruelty be used, because Billy wouldn't do anything to save himself. Billy wanted to quit. He was cold, hungry, embarrassed, and competent. He could scarcely distinguish between sleep and wakefulness now. On the 3rd day, found no important differences either between walking and standing still. He wished everybody would leave him alone. "You guys go on without me," he said again and again. Wary was as new to war as Billy. He was a replacement, too. As a part of a gun crew, he helped to fire one shot in an anger from 57 millimeter from a 57 millimeter anti-tank gun. The gun made a ripping sound like the opening of a zipper on the fly of God Almighty. The gun lapped up snow and vegetation with a blowtorch feet long. The flame left a black arrow on the ground, showing the Germans exactly where the gun was hidden. The shot was a miss. What had been missed was a Tiger tank. It swiveled its 88 millimeter snout about sniffily. Saw the arrow on the ground. It fired. It killed everybody on the gun crew but Wary. So it goes. Ronald Wary was only 18. Was at the end of an unhappy childhood spent mostly in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He had been unpopular in Pittsburgh. He had been unpopular because he was stupid and fat and mean and smelled like bacon no matter how much he washed. He was also being ditched in Pittsburgh by people who did not want to be with him. It made Wary sick to be ditched. When Wary was ditched, he would find somebody who was even more unpopular than himself, and he would horse around with that person for a while, pretending to be friendly, and then he would find some pretext for beating the shit out of him. It was a pattern. It was a crazy, sexy, murderous relationship Wary entered into with people he eventually beat up. He told them about his father's collection of guns and swords and torture instruments and leg irons and so on. Wary's father, who was a plumber, actually did collect such things, and his collection was insured for $4,000. He wasn't alone. He belonged to a big club composed of people who collected things like that. Wary's father once gave Wary's mother a Spanish thumbscrew in working condition for a kitchen paperweight. Another time, he gave her a table lamp whose base was a model 1 foot high of the famous Iron Maiden Nuremberg. The real Iron Maiden was a medieval torture instrument, a sort of boiler that was shaped like a woman and on the outside and lined with spikes. The front of the woman was composed of 2 hinge doors. The idea was to put a criminal inside and then close the doors slowly. There were 2 special spikes where his eyes would be. There was a drain in the bottom to let out all the blood. So it goes. I'm going to take a quick water break. Wary had told Billy Pilgrim about the Iron Maiden, about the drain in the bottom and what it was for. He had talked to Billy about dum-dums. He told him about his father's Derringer pistol, which could be carried in a vest pocket, which was yet capable of making a hole in a man's which a bull bat could fly through without touching either wing. Wary scornfully bet Billy one time that he didn't even know what a blood gutter was. Billy guessed that it was the drain in the bottom of the Iron Maiden, but that was wrong. A blood gutter, Billy learned, was a shallow groove in the side of a blade of a sword or a bayonet. Wary told Billy about neat tortures he'd read about or seen in movies or heard on the radio, about other neat tortures he himself had invented. One of the inventions was sticking a dentist drill into a guy's ear. He asked Billy what he thought was the worst form of execution was. Billy had no opinion. The correct answer turned out to be this. You stake a guy out on an anthill in a desert, see? He's face upward. You put honey all over his balls and pecker, and you cut off his eyelids so he has to stare at the sun till he dies. So it goes. Now, lying in a ditch with Billy and the scouts after having been shot at, Wary made Billy take a close look at his trench knife. It wasn't government issued. It was a present from his father. It had a 10-inch blade that was triangular in cross section. Its grip consists of brass knuckles, was a chain of rings through which Wary slipped his stubby fingers. The rings weren't simple. They were bristled with spikes. Wary laid the spikes along Billy's cheek, riled the cheek with savagely affectionate restraint. How'd you like to be hit by this? He wanted to know. I wouldn't, said Billy. You know why the blade's triangular? No. Makes a wound that won't close up. Oh. Makes a 3-sided hole in a guy. You stick an ordinary knife in a guy, makes a slit, right? A slit closes right up, right? Right. Shit. You know what? What the hell they teach you in college? I wasn't in there very long, said Billy, which was true. He had only 6 months of college, and the college hadn't been a regular college either. It had been a night school of the Millennium School of Optometry. Joe College, said Wary scathingly. Billy shrugged. There's more than life than what you read in books, said Wary. You'll find that out. Billy made no reply to this either. There in the ditch, since he didn't want the conversation to go on any longer than necessary, he was dimly tempted to say, though, that he knew one thing or two about gore. Billy, after all, had contemplated torture and hideous wounds at the beginning of the end of nearly every day of his childhood. Billy had an extremely gruesome crucifix hanging on the wall of his little bedroom in Ilium. A military surgeon would have admired the clinical fidelity of the artist's rendition of all Christ's wounds, the spear wound, the thorn wounds, the holes that were made by the iron spikes. Billy's Christ died horribly. He was pitiful, so it goes. Billy wasn't a Catholic, even though he grew up with a ghastly crucifix on the wall. His father had no religion. His mother was a substitute organist for several churches around town. She took Billy with her whenever she played, taught him how to play a little too. She said she was going to join a church as soon as she decided which one was right. She never did decide. She did develop a terrific hankering for a crucifix, though, and she had bought one from a Santa Fe gift shop during a trip the little family made out west during the Great Depression. Like so many Americans, she was trying to construct a life that made sense from things she found in gift shops. The crucifix went up on the wall of Billy Pilgrim. Two scouts, loving the walnut stalks of their rifles in the ditch, whispered that it was time to start moving out. 10 minutes had gone by without anybody seeing if they were hit or not. To finish them off, whoever had shot was evidently far away and all alone. The four crawled out of the ditch without drawing any more fire. They crawled into a forest like a big, unlucky mammals they were. Then they stood up and began to walk quickly. The forest was dark and cold. The pines were planted in ranks and files. There was no overgrowth. 4 inches of unmarked snow blanketed the ground. The Americans had no choice but to leave trails in the snow as ambiguous as diagrams in a book on ballroom dancing. Step, slide, rest. Step, slide, rest. Close it up and keys get closed, Ronald Weary warned Billy Pilgrim as they moved. Weary looked like Tweedledum or Tweedledee, all bundled up for battle. He was short and thick. He had every piece of equipment he had ever been issued, every present he'd received from home: helmet liner, wool cap, scarf, gloves, cotton undershirt, woolen undershirt, wool shirt, sweater, blouse, jacket, overcoat, cotton underpants, woolen underpants, woolen trousers, cotton socks, woolen socks, combat boots, gas mask, canteen, mess kit, first aid kit, trench knife, blanket, shelter half, raincoat, bulletproof Bible, a pamphlet entitled Know Your Enemy, another pamphlet entitled Why We Fight, and another pamphlet of German phrases rendered in English phonetics, which would enable Weary to ask Germans questions such as, where are your headquarters, and how many howitzers do you have? Or to tell them, surrender, your situation is hopeless, and so on. Weary had a block of balsa wood, which was supposed to be a foxhole pillow. He had a prophylactic kit containing 2 condoms for the prevention of disease only. He had a whistle he wasn't going to show anybody until he got promoted to corporal. He had a dirty picture of a woman attempting sexual intercourse with a Shetland pony. He had made Billy Pilgrim admire that picture several times. The woman and the pony were posed before velvet draperies, which were fringed in deedle balls. They were flanked by Doric columns. The front of the column was In front of the column was a potted palm. The picture that Weary had was a print of the first dirty picture in history. The word photography was first used in 1839. And it was the year that, too, that Louis J.M. Daguerre revealed to the French Academy that an image formed on a silvered metal plate covered with a thin film of silver iodide could develop the presence of a mercury vapor. In 1841, only 2 years later, an assistant to Daguerre, André Lefebvre, was arrested in the Tuileries garden for attempting to sell a gentleman a picture of a woman and the pony. That was where Weary bought his picture, too, in Tuileries. Lefebvre argued that the picture was fine art, and that his mission was to make Greek mythology come alive. He said that the columns and the potted palm proved that. When asked which myth he meant to represent, Lefebvre replied that there were thousands of myths like that, with the woman a mortal and the pony a god. He was sentenced to 6 months in prison. He died of pneumonia, so it goes. Billy and the scouts were skinny people. Ronald Weary had fat to burn. He was such a roaring furnace under all his layers of wool and straps and canvas. He had so much energy that he bustled back and forth between Billy and the scouts, delivering dumb messages which nobody had sent, which nobody was pleased to receive. He also became to suspect, since he was so much busier than everybody else, that he was the leader. He was so hot and bundled up, in fact, that he had no sense of danger. His vision of the outside world was limited to what he could see through a narrow slit between the rim of his helmet and the scarf from home, which concealed his baby face from the bridge of his nose on down. He was so smug that there that he was able to pretend he was safe at home, having survived the war, and that he was telling his parents and his sister a true war story, whereas the true war story was still going on. Wary's version of the true war story went like this. There was a big German attack, and Wary and his anti-tank buddies fought like hell until everybody was killed but Wary. So it goes. Then Wary tied in with 2 scouts, and they became close friends immediately, and they decided to fight them way back on their own lines. They were going to travel fast, they were damned if they would surrender, and they shook all hands around. They called themselves the 3 Musketeers. But then this damn college kid, who was so weak he shouldn't even have been in the army, asked if he could come along. He didn't even have a gun or a knife. He didn't even have a helmet or a cap. He couldn't even walk right, kept bobbing up and down, driving everybody crazy, giving their position away. He was pitiful. The 3 Musketeers pushed and carried and dragged the college kid all the way back on their own lines. Wary's story went, they saved his goddamned hide for him. In real life, Wary was retracting his steps, trying to find out what happened to Billy. He had told the scouts to wait while he went back for the college bastard. He passed under a low branch. It hit him at the top of his helmet with a clunk. Wary didn't hear it. Somewhere a big dog was watching. Wary didn't hear that either. His war story was at a very exciting point. An officer was congratulating the 3 Musketeers, telling them that he was going to put them in for bronze stars. What else can I do for you boys? Anything else I can do for you boys? Said the officer. Yes, sir, said one of the scouts. We'd like to stick together for the rest of the war, sir. Is there some way you could fix it so nobody will ever break up the 3 Musketeers? Billy Pilgrim had stopped in the forest. He was leaning against a tree with his eyes closed. His head was tilted back, and his nostrils were flaring. He was like a poet in the Parthenon. This was when Billy first came unstuck in time. His attention began to swing grandly through a full arc of his life, passing into death, which was violet light. There wasn't anybody else there or anything. There was just violet light and a hum. And when Billy swung into life again, going backwards until his pre-birth, which was red light and bubbling sounds, he was swung into life again and stopped. He was a little boy taking a shower with his hairy father at the Ilium YMCA. He smelled chlorine from the swimming pool next door, heard the springboard. Little Billy was terrified, because his father had said that Billy was going to learn how to swim by the method of sink or swim. His father was going to throw Billy into the deep end, and Billy was going to damn well swim. It was like an execution. Billy was numb as his father carried him from the shower room to the pool. His eyes were closed. When his eyes were closed, he was at the bottom of the pool, and there was beautiful music everywhere. He lost consciousness, but the music went on. He dimly sensed that somebody was rescuing him. Billy resented that. All right, so we have our first time jump. He's at the YMCA, and his dad's teaching him how to swim. From there, he had traveled in time to 1965. He was 41 years old. He was visiting his decrepit mother at Pine Knoll. An old people's home he had to put her in only a month before. She had caught pneumonia and wasn't expected to live. She did live, though, for years after that. Her voice was nearly gone. In order to hear her, Billy had to put his ear right next to her papery lips. She evidently had something very important to say. How, she began, and stopped. She was too tired. She hoped that she wouldn't have to say the rest of the sentence, and that Billy would finish it for her. But Billy had no idea what was on her mind. How what, Mother? He prompted. She swallowed hard, shed some tears, then she gathered energy from all over her ruined body. even her toes and fingertips. At last, she bad accumulated enough to whisper this complete sentence. How did I get so old? Billy's antique mother passed out, and Billy was led from the room by a pretty nurse. The body of an old man covered by a sheet was wheeled by just as Billy entered the corridor. The man had been a famous marathon runner in his day, so it goes. This was before Billy had his head broken in an airplane crash. By the way, before he became so vocal about flying saucers and traveling in time. Billy sat down in the waiting room. He wasn't a widower yet. He sensed something hard under his cushion of his overstuffed chair. He dug it out, discovered it was a book, The Execution of Private Slavic, by William Bradford Huey. It was a true account of the death before an American firing squad of Private Eddie D. Slovic, 36896415, the only American soldier to be shot for cowardice during the Civil War, so it goes. Billy read the opinion of the staff judge advocate who reviewed Slovic's case, which ended like this. He has directly challenged the authority of the government, and future discipline depends upon a resolute reply to this challenge. If the death penalty is ever to be imposed for desertion, it should be imposed in this case, not as a punitive measure nor as retribution, but to maintain the discipline upon which alone an army can succeed against the enemy. There is no recommendation for clemency in this case, and none is recommended here, so it goes. Billy blinked in 1965 and traveled in time to 1958. He was at a banquet in honor of a Little League team of which his son Robert was a member. The coach, who had never been married, was speaking. He was all choked up. Honest to God, I'd consider it an honor just to be a water boy for these kids. Okay, so we're going to put, that's a bad, there we go. That's also bad. There. Billy blinked in 1958 and traveled to 1961. It was New Year's Eve. Billy was disgracefully drunk at a party where everybody was in optometry or married to an optometrist. Billy usually didn't drink much because the war had ruined his stomach, but he certainly had a snoot full now, and he was being unfaithful to his wife Valencia for the first and only time. He had somewhat persuaded a woman to come to the laundry room of the house and then sit on the gas dryer, which was running. The woman was very drunk herself, and she helped Billy get her girdle off. What was it you were talking about, she said. It's all night, said Billy. He honestly thought it was all right. He couldn't remember the name of the woman. How come they call you Billy instead of William? Business reasons, said Billy. That was true. His father-in-law, who owned the Ilium School of Optometry, who had set Billy up for practice, was a genius in his field. He told Billy to encourage people to call him Billy because it would stick in their memories. It would make him seem slightly magical since there aren't any other grown Billies around. It also compelled people to think about him as a friend right away. Somewhere there was an awful scene with people expressing disgust for Billy and the woman, and Billy found himself out in his automobile trying to find the steering wheel. The main thing now was to find the steering wheel. At first, Billy windmilled his arms, hoping to find it by luck, but then that didn't work. He became methodical, working in such a way that the wheel could not possibly escape him. He placed himself against the left-hand door, searched every square inch of the area before him. When he failed to find the wheel, he moved over 6 inches, searched again. Amazingly, he was eventually hard against the right door. Without having found the wheel, he concluded that somebody stole it. This angered him, and he passed out. He was in the back seat of the car, which is why he couldn't find the steering wheel. Now somebody was shaking Billy awake. Billy still felt drunk and was still angered by the stolen steering wheel. He was back in the Second World War again, behind the German lines. The person who was shaking him was Ronald Wary, who had gathered the front of Billy's field jacket into his hands. He banged Billy against a tree, then puffed him away from it, flung him in the direction he was supposed to take under his own power. Billy stopped, shook his head. "You go on," he said. What? You guys go on without me. I'm all right. You're what? I'm okay. Jesus, I'd hate to see somebody sick, said Weary through five layers of humid scarf from home. Billy had never seen Wary's face. He tried to imagine it one time, and imagined a toad in a fishbowl. Wary kicked and shoved Billy for a quarter of a mile. The scouts were waiting between the blankets of the frozen creek. They heard the dog. They heard the men calling back and forth, two calling, two calling like hunters who had a pretty good idea of where their quarry was. The banks of the creek were high enough to allow the scouts to stand without being seen. Billy staggered down from the bank ridiculously. After him came Wary, clanking and tinkling and hot. Here he is, boy, said Wary. He don't want to live, but he's going to live anyway. And when he gets out of this, by God, he's going to owe his life to the three musketeers. Billy Pilgrim, there in the creek bed, thought he, Billy Pilgrim, was turning to steam painlessly. If everybody would leave him alone just for a little while, he thought, he wouldn't cause anybody any more trouble. He would turn to steam and float among the treetops. Somewhere the big dog barked again. With the help of fear and echoes and winter silences, that dog had a voice like a big bronze gong. Ronald Wary, 18 years old, insulated himself between the scouts, draped a heavy arm around the shoulder of each. So what do the three musketeers do now? He said. Billy Pilgrim was having a delightful hallucination. He was wearing dry, warm, white sweat socks, and he was skating on a ballroom floor. Thousands cheered. This wasn't time travel. This never happened. Never would happen. It was craziness of a dying young man with his shoes full of snow. One scout hung his head, let spit fall from his lips. The others did the same. They studied the infinitesimal effects of spit on snow in history. They were small, graceful people. They had been behind German lines before many times, like woods creatures, living from moment to moment in useful terror, thinking brainlessly with their spinal cords. Now they twisted out under Wary's loving arms. They told Wary he and Billy had to find somebody to surrender. The scouts weren't going to wait for them anymore. They ditched Wary and Billy in the creek bed. Billy Pilgrim went on skating, doing tricks in sweat socks, tricks that most people would consider impossible, making turns, stopping on a dime, and so on. The cheering went on, but the tone was altered as hallucination gave way to time travel. Billy stopped skating. He found himself at a lectern in a Chinese restaurant in Ilium, New York, on an early afternoon in the autumn of 1957. He was receiving a standing ovation from the Lions Club. He had just been elected president, and it was necessary that he speak. He was scared stiff, thought a ghastly mistake had been made. All those preposterous, solid men out there would discover now that they had elected a ludicrous waif. They would hear his reedy voice, the one he'd have in a war. He swallowed, knew that all he had for a box was a little whistle cut from a willow switch. Worse, he had nothing to say. The crowd quieted down. Everybody was pink and beaming. Billy opened his mouth, and out came a deep, resonant tone. His voice was a gorgeous instrument. It told jokes which brought down the house. It grew serious, told jokes again. It ended on a note of humility. The explanation of this miracle was this. Billy had taken a course in public speaking. And then he was back in the bed of the frozen creek again. Ron Weary was about to beat the living shit out of him. Weary was filled with a tragic wrath. He had been ditched again. He stuffed his pistol into his holster. He slipped his knife into its scabbard, its triangle blade and blood gutters of all three faces, and he shook Billy hard, rattled his skeleton, slammed him against the bank. Weary barked and whimpered through his layers of scarf from home. He spoke intelligibly of sacrifices he made on Billy's behalf. He dilated upon the piety and heroism of the three musketeers betrayed, and the most glowing and impassionate impassioned hues, their virtue and magnanimity, the perishable honor they acquire for themselves, and the services they render to Christianity. It was entirely Billy's fault that this fighting organization no longer existed where he felt, and Billy was going to pay. Where he socked Billy a good one on the side of the jaw. Knocked Billy away from the bank and onto the snow-covered ice of the creek. Billy was down on all fours on the ice, where he kicked him in the ribs, rolled him over on his side. Billy tried to form himself into a ball. "You shouldn't even be in the army," said Wary. Billy was involuntarily making convulsive sounds that were a lot like louder. "You think it's funny, huh?" Wary inquired. He walked around to Billy's back. Billy's jacket and shirt and undershirt had been hauled up around his shoulders by the violence, so his back was naked. There, inches from the tips of Wary's combat shoes, were the pitiful buttons of Billy's spine. Wary drew back his right foot, aimed to kick at the spine, at the tube which so many of Billy's important wires in it. Wary was going to break the tube. But then Wary saw that he had an audience. 5 German soldiers and a police dog on a leash were looking down into the bed of the creek. The soldiers' blue eyes were filled with bleary civilian curiosity as to why one American would try to murder the other one so far from home, and why the victim should laugh. Okay, so what we are taking away from this chapter is this. Our main character, Billy, he can time travel / unstuck in time. He can bounce anywhere from birth to death. The main setting in this chapter is him in World War II with good old Ronald Wary.